So there's this idea now that's quite popular that if there's any disparity in status or any disparity in hierarchy, then somebody starting a love relationship with somebody who's lower than them on a status hierarchy is inherently exploitative, right? That there's something immoral about, and I've seen this even like no matter how long that relationship lasts, no matter how much people are happy together, no matter how somebody would in hindsight say, I didn't see anything exploitative about this meeting. And because you're a woman, it's complicated because people don't usually see the woman in the higher status position. And that was something that I saw all over the place. I'm just curious if you think that that's contentless or if that's worth responding to.
So I think it is more specific than high-low status. I think if I had gotten together with someone who was lower status than a tenured professor, which is a lot of people, people wouldn't have been so upset about it. I think it's specifically that the person was a student and that they were a student in my own class. So I do think it's not just status, but it's power, right? And so there's the idea that I was in a position of power over him and that you shouldn't have romantic relationships that in that kind of context. And as a general rule, I think that's probably a good rule of thumb. But as I like explained on Twitter, because this is a somewhat fraught situation, the university has a whole bunch of regulations for how to do it. And I followed all of those rules, including not starting a relationship with him while he was my student. That is, he was officially his work was transferred over to somebody else, etc. I think that if we're thinking about this in a broader perspective of like, what do we want to encourage as a culture? I guess I think if everybody did what I did when they were in romantic relationships with students, namely announce the relationship to officials at the university immediately, get out of the supervisory role, create a track record such that were I had to do this over and over again, it would be very well known because they'd all be announced. I think we wouldn't really have any problems with faculty-student relationships. So
Okay.
I think that that is all of the problem cases, and I know of many of them, are kept secret. They're people who don't talk about it, and so they can't be monitored or regulated, and the abuses are unknown because they're secret.
Yeah, I think that most of the time somebody in a position of power is a man, and most of the time there are heterosexual relationships with men in a position of power and women in a position of less power or subservient kind of role. And this, we don't have to talk about evolutionary psychology that much. I do have a question about that at some point because I know that you talk to Robin a lot. But in some sense, it's unusual for somebody in a position of power to want to be in a serious relationship with somebody in a position of less power than they are, rather than somebody. Usually people in positions of power, I mean, one of the whole reasons that people are motivated to attain power is to have multiple relationships, not to have singular, serious romantic relationships, right? And so that's what you're saying is the problem comes from.
Right. I should say that, as reported in the piece, this was very much not private. Like even if it was not in the New Yorker originally,
No.
but it was something I announced to the university, and I even gave a talk about it to the university community. And there wasn't much outrage. And it was well known within philosophical circles because, of course, gossip spread.
Yeah.
And many of the people who were very, very outraged by it on Twitter 11 years later were not outraged by it at the time when it occurred, which is like puzzling phenomenon, right? Why didn't you object to this back when, he actually had just been my student or whatever, rather than like 10 years later when we're married and he is a faculty member? And I think, so this is part of why I didn't take the reaction that seriously, is that those people had like 10 years to come to me and object and say, hey, I think there's a problem here.
Mm-hmm.
But they didn't until this piece came out. And I think it's the Rorschach test effect again. It's like the piece they found confronting, sort of upsetting, more personal than they wanted it to be. And they were looking like, where in this can we find something, to make a moral objection to? And they fasten on something, but that very thing is not something that actually upset them when it showed up in their lives, sort of proximately.